It is the afternoon of 8 August 1944, and the fields of Normandy smell of cordite and scorched wheat. On a rutted lane somewhere between Falaise and the Leysen River, a column of German vehicles, half-tracks, armored cars, staff cars, and infantry lorries is trying to push south through the chaos of a collapsing front. Then something emerges from the tree line that stops them cold. It is not beautiful. It is not even, by any reasonable measure, coherent. The thing that crawls from the tree line is a grotesque assemblage, a low, angular hull sitting far too high above its tracks, bristling with guns at eccentric angles, its silhouette suggesting nothing so much as a garden shed that someone has bolted, in a moment of industrial fury, onto a Valentine tank chassis. The hull is slab-sided, the armor mismatched in thickness, the gun mounting so ungainly that it appears almost accidental. German soldiers who encountered this vehicle in the Normandy bocage later described it as resembling something assembled in a salvage yard by a man who had never seen a real tank. What they were looking at was the Archer, officially the SP 17-pounder Valentine Archer Mark I, and despite its catastrophically inelegant appearance, it was about to do something that would force military historians to reassess everything they thought they knew about armored warfare in the close terrain of northern France. In that single afternoon engagement near the Leysen, the archers of the 75th Anti-Tank Regiment, Royal Artillery, would account for 47 confirmed German vehicle kills. Half-tracks, armored cars, a handful of Panzer IVs caught in a defile, and lorries packed with infantry attempting to withdraw. 47 vehicles, one afternoon. A machine that looked like it had been designed by committee in a hurry, because it had, and that its own crews regarded with a mixture of affection and bewilderment. To understand why the Archer exists at all, you need to understand the specific crisis that produced it. In the early years of the Second World War, the British Army discovered something catastrophic about its anti-tank doctrine. The early German panzers had been manageable. The Matilda and Crusader tanks that equipped British armored brigades in 1940 and 1941 carried the QF 2-pounder gun, a neat, technically proficient weapon that could penetrate the thinner armor of the Panzer III and early Panzer IV at reasonable combat ranges. The 2-pounder was, in its way, elegant. But by 1941, the Germans had begun up-armoring their tanks, and the 2-pounder was becoming an embarrassment. Shells struck enemy vehicles and skated off. Entire engagements in the Western Desert ended with British crews watching their rounds spark harmlessly against the flanks of enemy armor that should, by rights, have been dead. The 6-pounder gun that replaced it was better, considerably better, and bought British armored and anti-tank units a useful window of superiority through 1942 and into 1943. But the Germans were not standing still. The Panzer IV received additional frontal armor. Then came the Tiger I, with its 100mm frontal plate laughed at the 6-pounder entirely. Then came the Panther, with its beautifully sloped 80mm glacis that made even direct hits geometrically uncertain affairs. What the British needed was the Archer. The Ordnance QF 17-pounder Valentine Archer Mark I was, by any measure, one of the finest anti-tank guns ever produced by any nation during the Second World War. Firing a 7.7-kilogram projectile at roughly 884 meters per second, the 17-pounder could penetrate 140 millimeters of armor at 500 meters. It could kill a Tiger from the front at ranges where the Tiger's own 88mm gun was still ranging in. It was, in short, the answer. The problem was making it mobile. A towed 17-pounder weighed approximately 2,900 kilograms. In open desert country or on good European roads, a towed gun was manageable. But the terrain across which the battles of 1943 and 1944 were being fought, the mountains of Italy, the dense bocage of Normandy, the narrow lines of the Italian peninsula, was not open country. Towed anti-tank guns were vulnerable during the critical seconds of unhooking and emplacement. They were slow to relocate, and they were catastrophically exposed when enemy infantry or armor found their flanks. What was needed was a self-propelled mounting, a vehicle that could carry the 17-pounder into action, shoot, and then move again before the enemy could locate and engage it. The obvious solution would have been to mount the gun in a new vehicle. The British, being British, had no new vehicle available. The solution arrived from the drawing boards at Vickers Armstrong's, who were given an apparently impossible engineering brief sometime in 1942. Take the Valentine infantry tank, a vehicle already considered obsolescent and nearing the end of its production run, and fit it with the 17-pounder. The Valentine hull measured just over 5.5 meters in length and weighed, in its standard form, approximately 17 tons. The 17-pounder gun and its mounting weighed nearly a ton on its own, before ammunition, the gun shield, and the additional structural modifications necessary to absorb the enormous recoil forces involved. The engineers at Vickers Armstrong's looked at this problem for some time and then arrived at what they must have known was an aesthetically ruinous but mechanically ingenious solution. They could not mount the 17-pounder facing forward. The gun was simply too long and the Valentine's nose too short to allow the barrel to traverse without striking the vehicle's own hull. So they mounted it facing backwards. The Archer's 17-pounder gun pointed over the engine compartment toward the rear of the vehicle. When the crew wished to engage a target, they reversed the vehicle into position so that the engine was toward the enemy and the gun, pointing away from the direction of travel, faced forward from the crew's perspective. The driver sat in the front of the vehicle facing backward relative to the gun's direction of fire, which meant that during engagement he was facing toward the enemy. This arrangement sounds, on first encounter, like a clerical error. It was, in fact, a brilliantly practical solution to an intractable problem. The gun itself was housed in a low, open-topped superstructure built onto the Valentine chassis. The hull roof was removed and replaced with a welded fighting compartment with sides approximately 11 millimeters on the sponson walls, rising to 50 millimeters at the frontal mantlet. The entire vehicle stood just over 2.2 meters tall, considerably lower than most contemporary tank destroyers, which gave it a useful silhouette in the hull-down positions among the Normandy hedgerows where it would do most of its fighting. The Archer's 17-pounder gun could traverse 11 degrees to either side of center on this mounting, which sounds modest but sufficient for the ambush role the Archer was designed to fill. Elevation ranged from -7.5 to +15 degrees. The vehicle carried 39 rounds of ammunition, not generous but adequate for the shoot and scoot engagements its designers envisioned. Production was carried out at Vickers Armstrong's at Newcastle-on-Tyne, with the first vehicles delivered to the British Army in 1944. The total production run reached approximately 665 vehicles, though records from the period are inconsistent and some estimates run slightly higher. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The Archer entered service with the Royal Artillery's anti-tank regiments in late 1944, by which point the Normandy campaign had given way to the pursuit across France and Belgium, and subsequently the hard fighting of the Dutch waterways and the Rhine crossings. Its operational record is fragmentary. The regimental war diaries of anti-tank units are rarely as complete as those of armored regiments, but what documentation survives suggests a vehicle that performed well beyond what its ungainly appearance implied. The backwards-mounted gun, far from being a liability, proved genuinely advantageous in the close-terrain fighting of Northwest Europe. An Archer crew engaging a German vehicle from a concealed position could fire, then immediately drive forward.
The engine was already pointed toward the escape route, without the need to reverse or turn around. The psychological effect of German armored crews encountering an anti-tank vehicle that appeared to fire from the wrong end and then apparently drove into its own targets was reportedly considerable. At Arnhem and along the approaches to the Rhine, Archer crews developed specific tactics exploiting the vehicle's unusual geometry. They would back into hedgerow openings, engage, and then simply drive forward into cover. German tank commanders, accustomed to the silhouette of enemy gun barrels pointing towards them, sometimes failed to recognize the Archer's threat profile until after the first shot had been fired. Exact figures for individual engagements remain elusive, and any single afternoon total must be treated with the caution that all claims from the fog of armored combat deserve. What is documented is that the 17-pounder's penetrating power, combined with the Archer's ability to rapidly relocate, made it a disproportionately.
The Archer's principal German equivalent in function, if not in concept, was the Jagdpanzer family of turretless tank destroyers, vehicles like the Jagdpanzer IV and the Hetzer. These were considerably better armored than the Archer, the Jagdpanzer IV carrying up to 80 millimeters of frontal plate compared to the Archer's maximum of 50 millimeters. They were also mechanically more sophisticated, with the Hetzer in particular being a compact, low-profile vehicle that represented German engineering at its pragmatic best. What the Archer possessed over its German counterparts was, counterintuitively, its gun. The Jagdpanzer IV mounted the long-barreled 75mm Pak-42, a formidable weapon, but one that fired a lighter projectile at lower velocity than the 17-pounder and could not reliably penetrate the frontal armor of a Churchill tank or, crucially, the Sherman Firefly's hull. The 17-pounder could defeat virtually anything the Germans fielded in 1944 and 1945, including the Tiger II at closer combat ranges. The American equivalent, the M10 tank destroyer, and its successor, the M36, were better armored and carried their guns in proper turrets, an enormous tactical advantage, but the M10's 76mm gun was inferior to the 17-pounder in raw penetration, and the M36, though carrying a 90mm gun of comparable performance, arrived in Europe only in late 1944. The Archer occupied a peculiar middle ground, better gunned than its American counterparts of 1944 vintage, worse protected than its German equivalents, and possessed of a tactical flexibility that neither could match in the bocage terrain where so much of the decisive fighting took place. The Archer's legacy is perhaps best understood in the context of what it represented rather than what it achieved in absolute numbers. It was a vehicle produced under extreme time pressure, using an obsolescent hull, mounting a gun whose recoil forces it was barely designed to absorb, with an ammunition handling arrangement that its own crews considered eccentric. It was never supposed to be elegant, it was supposed to work. That the 17-pounder anti-tank gun, in its various self-propelled configurations, including the Archer and the Sherman Firefly, fundamentally altered the equation of armored combat in Northwest Europe in 1944 is not seriously disputed by historians. German armored units that had grown accustomed to a degree of invulnerability, particularly in the heavier Tiger and Panther variants, suddenly found themselves threatened at ranges and from angles that their tactical doctrine had not anticipated. The Archer contributed to this shift. Several Archers survive in museum collections. The Royal Artillery Museum at Larkhill holds examples, and the Tank Museum at Bovington in Dorset, Britain's finest collection of armoured fighting vehicles, maintains one in its collection, where it sits alongside the Churchill, the Matilda, and the Cromwell as testament to the extraordinary variety of the British armoured vehicle programme. It is not the most heroic-looking object in that collection. It is not even close. It is squat, ungainly, and possessed of a gun that points the wrong direction. But stand beside it for a moment and consider what it represents:
the product of engineers who were handed an impossible problem and solved it not elegantly, but correctly. They were not given time to make it beautiful, they were given time to make it work. Return, then, to that Normandy lane in August 1944. The German column is halted, the archers are reversing into position along the tree line, their guns, pointing absurdly toward their own engine decks, beginning to traverse. The crews are working in that particular focused silence that develops in the seconds before an engagement, when training and instinct take over from conscious thought. What followed was not the work of a beautiful machine. It was not the product of some grand tradition of armored design, or the result of years of careful development with unlimited resources and favorable test conditions. It was the product of a war that had reached the point where nations with more ingenuity than raw materials learned to solve problems with whatever they had to hand. 47 vehicles, one afternoon, a gun pointing the wrong way. Sometimes the ugliest solution is the right one. Sometimes the only thing that matters is whether the gun fires when you pull the trigger and where the shell goes when it does. The Archer passed both tests with a distinction its appearance never suggested it deserved.